Cosmic here, and welcome back to another Legends of Runeterra video. Today we're going to be doing something very different. So I'm going to warn you up front and tell you this video is not for everyone. You might know that Swim does the current meta decks in terms of the report, goes over the Mobalytics data, just talks about kind of what's been performing well, what he expects to see, and then most importantly, he puts a tier list together, which then a lot of people follow. I'm going to do something a little bit different. We're going to be breaking down the data in terms of what it actually means from a trending perspective, what to expect in the coming weeks, and kind of what were people expecting to play both, as Tuesday Vault resets, people get more cards, and then kind of what we'd expect to see towards the end of the week as the meta starts to develop. Because we've seen time and time again that the meta within Legends of Runeterra is very fluid in terms of even day-to-day, sometimes AM to PM, right? So how it can change and how you're prepared for it can impact your ladder success. And really what I'm trying to do is help educate and talk about why certain trends of the data might seem a lot worse than what they really are. And obviously the hot topic last week was burn, and it's going to be very interesting to see where it trends from here. So keeping in mind, I really wanted to do this as more of a monthly report where I would track the win rate of certain decks, how often they're being played, what are kind of the up-and-coming decks, which then track their win rate, and also what cards are being played, right? The disclaimer I will add here is that overall the Mobalytics data is pretty shallow, but there is eventually going to be more added, or more available, I should say. So this will only get better as time goes on, but for right now, it's basically win rate, how long the games take, the top 5 played cards, which can be very uninteresting, unfortunately, just based on how the meta is shaking out. And that's about it. And then it has everything from a deck that's been played for 100,000 games all the way down to a single play of a type of deck. So it's very interesting, and I will have the Excel files in the comments section as well if you kind of want to dig into the data yourself and figure it out, right? So the other kind of last thing that I'm going to say up front, and I'm kind of doing this all now because it's my first video, and it needs to set some expectations here, right? I come from a very heavy analytics background. I have a psych degree with an IO and social focus, and really what that means is I've done I wrote a thesis. I've done some studies on the effects of trends in data in terms of how the general public, right, is going to be affected by it. So if you really want to know more of because these numbers are going to be public, how the average person might react to them and what that means for your own meta gaming, that's kind of more the details that I want to get into. So this isn't really going to be more of a, here's my tier 1 deck of the week, this is what you should play. Really more going to be talking about both the psychology side of things and the data behind it. So that's enough rambling, but the last kind of disclaimers up front here is that understanding where the data comes from, because at the end of the day, that's going to be very important. It's very important to note this is only a sample of all games. So, right there, depending on how important the data is to you and how pure you want it to be, right? This is, in fact, a biased sample. And what I mean by that, it's only of people who are using the Mobalytics deck tracker. We could make the assumption that on average, they're going to have a higher win rate because the average person's not going to know about it. They already have an interest in their own data. So generally speaking, they are going to be a player who is either researched and or kind of knows the plays that they should be making already, right? So it's going to be skewed in that direction. And then one of the biggest things here is that if you look in the data file, right, there is anywhere again from a certain type of deck having 100,000 plays all the way down to, it breaks down to like 300s. And obviously past that, it's just like 50 and 60, right? So in this, I'm going to set thresholds that I believe are going to be fair. And that's really just by looking at the data, trying to figure out where is a good threshold for enough sample size. Generally speaking, 300 is the minimum, the absolute minimum I would ever do from a personal research standpoint. Obviously, that's going to change based on the overall sample size and other considerations that you'll have to make. But generally speaking, when we get to the Masters, it'll be 300. And then because there are so few Master players right now, or if you're like me and you've hit Masters and you're not playing it actively right now, a single person, assuming a streamer, someone who plays a lot, whatever, they can actually skew the data. So hopefully long term, this won't be an issue. But generally speaking, I would say that Masters level data is a very poor look right now, and it's not something that I would feel confident reporting out on, and I wouldn't recommend anyone to take very strong inferences of that data. That said, at some point you realize that we only have either a look at all of the data or Masters only, so you have to kind of make these limits, kind of how far you want to dig into it and kind of what is the value in that. So we've reached out to Mobalytics already. I know people on TLG have been working with Mobalytics in terms of other stuff. So eventually I hope we get more data, but as of right now, this is kind of the first look at it. So again, I think this will be a bit more interesting from a overall standpoint. What does this look like from a meta perspective, and how did this trend leading up to the balance patch, right? Because in theory, there's going to be 4 of these and then the balance patch and what that really means. So first and foremost, we really just have to deal with the elephant in the room, right? Burn aggro. So something to keep in mind is there needs to be a larger discussion that happens here, both from a reporting standpoint in terms of like why this is so high, what does it really mean, and then also understanding the influence that people like Swim, just very bluntly, he's the person putting the other tier list together, he's going to have an influence on this data. There's no possible way that you can say that Swim wasn't the core, I shouldn't say core, but one of the main factors, right, why burn was so high. And why do I mention that, right? So on May 4th, in one of his YouTube videos, Swim actually had mentioned that this was the end-all, be-all deck. Sorry, let me phrase this. It was the best deck to play for climbing ladder. And, right, let's think about that statement for a second, right? This is a ladder-focused ranked system, meaning that you want to have the shortest games possible, and not always with the highest win rate, because that's not the only important factor there, but with a decent enough win rate that you can climb games. So, Swim had said this was the deck to play. Don't bother playing anything else. This is the only thing that you should take into consideration. Now, something to keep in mind, if you think about the data from last week, and I'll put it up there for reference, there was the deep deck, which was previously the week 1 terror of the meta, if you will, right? So this is where I kind of wanted to take a step back and break down these 2 different data points and the different reasons for why they're going to have a different influence. Now, again, the note here I'll leave up front is that, yes, I do feel that burn is very strong, and that it most likely will see some kind of change in the upcoming balance patch. But from day one, I was very adamant that it would not see an emergency balance patch, and I think that's where a lot of the discussions were heading, that a lot of people were expecting them to just have a knee-jerk reaction to this. And one week of data is not enough in any sense, unless it's something like we've seen other card games that have just glaringly balance issues that require it, but this just wasn't the case, and there's quite a few reasons for that. So, as I mentioned, let's kind of break this down at several different points, right? The ladder. You want to have short games. If you think about deep on average, and again, this is all, and I had to look at my notes here, all the data is available in that file. If you look at the deep average game length, it was 10 minutes. When you compare that to burn, it cut all the way back down to 7 minutes. And then again, keeping in mind, just an average, but I know a lot of people, as you get into platinum, as you get into diamond, your games generally can be even shorter because you're looking at things from it's turn 5, either win or lose, you scoop, you go into the next game, right? So just from a pure volume of games played perspective, right? So on the next couple bits here, we'll see how many games, the game breakdown for each one of them, right? Burn is just going to get so far ahead in the numbers of games played that most people are going to favor that just because you want to climb as fast as possible. And again, Swim was right. He was 100% accurate in his statement. There's certainly no denying that, but that doesn't tell, again, the full story. So let's take another step back from there, right? Let's talk about the accessibility of the burn aggro deck. So again, if you're not familiar with it, it's a championless deck. And quite honestly, if you're someone who's either gone through their region tracks already, or if you just saved up like 2 vaults worth of stuff, generally you're able to access this deck. It only cost 6,000 shards. That is nothing, absolutely nothing in the context of Runeterra. Again, for the comparison to the deep deck, again, it was 27.6k shards. That is extremely difficult for the average player to have that early on in the meta, right? Again, this is only week 2 worth of data. So Couple of factors. One, Swim, he said it was the end-all, be-all deck. That's just a factor that you have to consider based on his role in kind of the global Runeterra things. Two, accessibility. It was an extremely, extremely cheap deck to make, meaning more people were playing it, more people were more likely to run into it because of that, and it was just something that people could get in a very short amount of time. So again, no surprise there. The third factor, kind of on top of this yet again, is going to be the length of games. Aggro decks will always be favored in the overall ladder meta. Period. That will not change unless there is some kind of glaring balance issue where control decks can really come together. So hopefully all of that kind of helps better understand where Burn was really placed in this meta. But let's take this one step further, right? Deep, if you look at the data, there is no way that you could possibly look at that share of the meta and not say that people were running into it, people were frustrated by it, right? Again, I'm one of the mods, so maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I remember a lot of people complaining about Deep. However, not as many people really felt so strongly against it. And why is that, right? And this is where more the psychology aspect of it comes into play. And again, generally speaking, anyone who with a TCG background can tell you, but it comes down to more of the agency and the amount of time that you've really got to play that game, right? If you think about the Burn deck against just an average field, right? Games are going to be over super quick. They end, very quick. You feel like you queue in, you play like 3 cards, and that's it. That's not a good experience. And this is where the discussion needs to shift from, is it too strong to is it fun to play against? And that's one of the things that, again, I think not a lot of people were talking about. And when I got into my rant on Twitter, that's the very last thing that I put on there because I wanted to make sure that people were seeing the overall message. That community perspective is still important to how strong or weak a deck is. And again, when you put Burn into this meta where people are very unrefined, they haven't had a chance to really, either get all the cards for their deck or they're still trying to figure it out, right? There's other parts of this that you have to kind of picture in that overall global meta that Burn just punishes you. And by punish, I mean that in a very literal sense in this case that, again, you play maybe 2 or 3 cards, you're down to like 5 health and you go, well, all right, well, there's no way I can play. Let's go on to the next one. Now let's think about the Deep matchup, right? Very, very long game. It's always going to go to like 8, 9, 10 mana. No matter if your deck is just going to always auto lose to them in the sense that your end game is just not good, you at least feel like you've played a game, you've done something, you've tried to resolve your cards, you've tried to chip away at their HP, and it's a much different mindset. Even if you were never going to win that match, just naturally by being able to play more of the cards and feeling like you had more of an influence in that game, you're going to just, by, again, a very binary comparison here, you're going to hate the Deep deck much less compared to the Burn deck just based on the amount of time that you spent in the match. So this is a very long-winded way to say, was Burn a problem in the last week? Yes. Was it nearly as bad as everyone claimed it to be? Probably not. There's a lot of other factors that need to be taken in consideration here. And also, who knows how early we would have seen that, right? What would have happened if Swim, or again, I'm just using him as the kind of the king example here because he puts a tier list together, but think about the streamer influence overall, right? What if Burn didn't pop up until, Thursday or Friday, right? Towards the very late end of the week instead of, day one, you have your vault, go craft your deck, right? Burn, even though it was still cheap, wouldn't have been as popular and the percentage here would have went down. I think this is where I want to do more of the monthly report and to see how these change, right? So we've seen Deep goes from week 1 issue to non-existent. Scouts, week 1, stupid high win rate. Everyone agrees that Demacia is too good. Week 2, nothing, right? It's important to track this data and understand what it means from a high-level concept because, again, this is only part of the data. Riot has the rest of it. Now, again, could I see Demacia and Burn both having some kind of, I should stop saying Burn, but just aggro in general, right? If you think about the reach cards that they have, could I see them getting changed in 2 weeks when the balance patch happens? Yes. Is it still frustrating to play against? Yes. But is there other factors that need to be taken into consideration and have more research done on terms of the overall effect that they're having in the meta? Absolutely yes. It was far too early to expect anything this week, but now we can finally shift the discussion from, got that kind of elephant out of the room, addressed, I should say, and now we can talk about what this means from a look forward. So again, keeping in mind, all Mobalytics data is going to lag by a week. So this is more of just trying to kind of predict where things are going and what that might mean from a meta perspective. Again, I'm not going to kind of talk about these all and kind of break them down. There's just a few high-level things that I want to talk about, right? So Karina Control was definitely the big winner of week 2, and no surprise, it kind of carried through the weekend, and I'm expecting that we're going to see it a lot more in this early meta. What the average person is really going to be looking to, and what people I think are, if Reddit has told me anything, people are kind of incorrectly focusing on. So the win rate here, obviously, Karina Control is the winner, and there's a slew of other decks that are going to be taken into consideration. But again, this is where you kind of have to marry these two together and really understand what this means, right? So you could look at these, you could just say, okay, here's the highest win rate deck, and that's what I should go with, but that would be wrong. This is kind of the weird spot where Karina Control is probably still a good meta call in general. So this is kind of one of those things that like, hey, that's still fine. But if you think about like Scouts and Kinku, and even like the mono Demacia decks have really started to fall off. So this is where you have to take into consideration, what does this mean going forward, right? So thinking about it from a meta perspective, we saw last week a lot of aggro decks were popping up, and no matter where you looked, right, people were talking about it. Naturally, as a response to that, Shadow Isle is kind of the main counter to it, so more Shadow Isles decks started to pick up. That's where we start to see the Karina Control influence here start to pick up from the previous week. What's missing from this, and I know that BBG has been playing a lot, but then the meta goes into that kind of next step. Okay, once aggro is out of the way, once the meta is more stabilized, it's really Ionia that comes back to punish a lot of players because you slow down the game, it gets to late game, and then quite literally you can't beat the Karma and Ezreal types of decks as they get to late game, or you have a Heimerdinger deck that just like combos off and just outvalues you, and there's no real good strategies to punish that other than aggro. If you think about back to open beta where we had basically nothing but that more Ionia meta for what felt like forever, we didn't have strong aggro representation, and that was something that was sorely missing from open beta, and that's why I'm kind of worried about what this looks like after the balance patch if things kind of go away, right? Even when Hecarim Rally was around, and again, slightly too strong, that's why it got nerfed, but at least it existed to keep some of those decks in check because you had rally effects that could keep, those very greedy turns. They would go under 4 mana, they can't deny it, right? And even sometimes where you're just getting in maybe 7-8 points of damage, that was enough to then help close out the game. So somebody has to stick around to keep Ionia in check, and that's where it's really important. So if we think about what this means from a region representation, right? So again, this is still the all ranks data. We went from a aggro deck meta to Shadow Isles. What I'm expecting to see this week, we're going to see a shift from Shadow Isles to Ionia. So more of the Karma Lux, more of Karma Ezreal, that type of things, right? Because the aggro decks are just getting pushed out. Is it still a good list to climb with? Probably. I really still strongly prefer They Who Endure. But again, They Who Endure is stuck in this middle ground where if you're seeing a lot of aggro decks, great, enjoy free wins. If you're starting to see more Ionia decks, great, enjoy your free losses. And it sucks. But that's just kind of the nature of where that falls in line with the meta. And then from there, it goes from, okay, once Ionia becomes strong again, then the aggro decks need to come back to punish it. So if Ionia starts to pick back up again, Shadow Isles falls off, aggro tries to get represented, and then things like Demacia are just generally good because their removal is bad against it in a lot of cases, right? If you think about Ionia and PNZ being a very popular pairing, if you have over 4 HP, it's going to feel pretty bad for your opponent because you get more value out of it. So that's where, again, unfortunately, Demacia is probably going to come back. So what did the representation look like, right? We talk a lot about burn is everywhere. Obviously PNZ is represented in that meta, but what's the breakdown? Like, how healthy is it from an overall representation standpoint? And that's where it gets pretty depressing, if I'm going to be honest. The high end, right, 30% for Shadow Isles and 34% for Noxus. Perhaps not too surprising. Noxus just being the aggro core that we've expecting, and a lot of people are trying out Swain and seeing how it is. What's alarming is the 51% for PNZ, which is kind of interesting that thinking back to open beta, very early open beta, it was a very unloved region, very low percent representation because people just weren't using it. But now because it's being used for both Karina Control and it's being used in all 3 archetypes, right? So for Control, you were seeing it with Karina Control, with aggro, we're seeing it with the burn deck, and then even some of those more mid-range variants, we're still seeing it because you need to respect the early game, and it just fits an overall, good part in the versatility is what's really important. So PNZ is strong by nature, but maybe not too strong in that it needs to be nerfed. It just has a good overall representation. What's really sad is then Freljord, right? This is one that it doesn't feel good to build right now, right? The Bilgewater cards just steal your stuff. So if you try either like the Starlit Seer side, or you try the Outriders, or even in some cases for the Sejuani's build where you just buff your entire deck, all three of those are just very strongly countered by Bilgewater if they just high roll and steal your stuff. And it creates a very feels bad, story behind it. So then you think about what's the only other thing that they have, right? War Mothers. And actually, War Mothers is still very good against aggro decks, but maybe you're starting to figure this out. What's the problem there? Aggro decks have to exist to make Ionia in check, where you can actually play a game where you're not getting countered by deny every other game is what it feels like. So this could increase, right, if aggro decks stick around, but it's very unlikely we're going to see that this week. It should be a Ionia meta. I'm sure, at the time of recording this, I didn't see any, I think I saw 2 Ionia decks, I should say. I barely saw any Ionia decks, but as this week goes on, if the meta continues to develop at the rate that it is, Ionia will be the next decks that are played. Burn decks are falling out of favor. Shadow Owls are then going to get caught by that same, their good matchups are leaving, so it's going to be probably an unfun time of getting back to Karma, but hey, we'll see. And then next week's data will be a very interesting look back at this week that was. So going on from there, we need to talk about Masters data. And again, I want to be very clear that this is, as of right now, it's not that great of data. I mentioned up front, the people who are playing, again, either streamers or people who are just maybe offline grinders, which they exist. I fully, you can't look at the Masters list and not expect that, hey, there's not streamers on here. There's just people who are enjoying the game, playing it a lot, and have hit Masters, right? So any one person can skew these in a meaningful way that it's really hard to kind of look at this and by a side-by-side comparison and say, okay, well, yes, Burn is still really up there. Karina Control is either keeping it in check, but there's still 21% of other decks. And this is where are they playing memes? Is it good decks? Is it, stuff that they're working on? This is where a discussion needs to happen, where it's more of a, what I would like to call pro tour meta, right? Where it's kind of this just hyper focused. Everyone kind of knows what everyone else is playing. It's not necessarily a healthy look at the overall representation. So this is where I hope that we'll eventually get Platinum and Diamond, and then obviously Masters being tapped on to the top of that as well. I want to see that combination because I think that's more telling. And then you could look at the all meta breakdown versus just the kind of the top part where Riot is balancing, and it has a bit more of an important message behind it. So should not be surprising at all. These were the good decks, right, of that week. So it's really no surprise here. And this was really the first time that people were hitting Masters. So we really need to kind of see this develop more over time. This, makes sense that it's representative of kind of the all regions because a lot of different factors here to consider. But Burn was very good. There wasn't a lot of Shadow Isles decks very early on to keep it in track. But then once we start to get things a bit more balanced out, you really start to see this kind of rock, paper, scissors meta, right? And this is what's kind of interesting and I think needs a bit more focus. You have Burn aggro, Karina Control, and Heimer Control, right? So Ionia there can definitely be nice at keeping Karina Control in balance, right? They try to adapt Vi to shore up the aggro meta, but it's not necessarily all the way there yet. So you do have this kind of like interesting meta triangle just between those 3 decks. Heimer Control really needed to fill a more combo role in this variant, where if you look at the immediate representation of the other ones from there, right, the 4 other decks just aren't getting a lot of representation. So very quickly, and this has already happened, again, based on our Team Leviathan Gaming meta snapshot that I was a part of and talking to our EU teammates, this has already happened at High Masters. It's kind of rushed into those top 3 decks and really left off with this kind of triangle meta, which, again, I would argue that's not healthy for Runeterra overall because the way that our balancing works. And that's something that you would find more in Magic, where their metas are a bit more rigid, right, in their structure just by nature of how the deck building process works and how it's a bit different. So this is where I'd say that, yes, it's a little cautionary tale of we need to pay attention to this, but again, very low sample size. I'm not going to put too much weight into this, but something that I think is going to be very interesting to trend kind of week over week. And then again, kind of the same note here. I just know that some people find this interesting. And this is, again, where I'd kind of focus more on what are the up and coming decks, right? What should I be thinking about for the next week? Again, and this is where you start to see now the very heavy Ionia influence that's happening here, right? So as those Shadow Isles decks came up, as more people got into Masters, Ionia decks were really kind of the theme here in terms of what were the highest win rate decks as they started to counter those other ones. Then Elusive OTK kind of just being what I would call an outlier here, because again, 478 games, not a lot at all. But still interesting about where it fits into this overall meta. So interesting points, but something we don't have to worry about too much. And then lastly, again, that kind of same representation about what does it look like from a region breakdown, and again, skewing even harder into that PNZ notion here. But again, that's largely going to be because people are focused on playing the aggro burn deck and then also playing the counter, which there's a huge overlap. So not too surprising. And again, keeping in mind that this is a very low sample size, but it is very interesting to see. So again, that's kind of like the overall breakdown. I really want to do these at a more monthly level, because I think that's where we'd have more of the data, more of the story. Maybe that's where we get more into the duration of the games played. We look at the top picked cards from each one. But really, I want to open this up as a general discussion. What type of meta report do you want to see, right? I think Swim does a great job, and I by no means want to focus on what he does about talking about the top decks, going through each one of them and kind of breaking those down, where I really want to be focused more on kind of the math behind it, understanding why certain decks are trending certain ways, and then also the predictability of the meta. And I honestly think I have a pretty good representation of that, or idea of what that looks like, because I've been playing since preview patch 1, and because I know kind of what these natural counters are. I think that's kind of where the discussion stops on Swim side of thing, where he's like, hey, here's the decks that you should play this week, right? And I think that's fine. But then there also needs to be some kind of conversation around what does that actually look like. You know, we know what Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday will bring, but then past that, there's more stuff that generally happens. And obviously streamers are going to have a big influence on that just by the way the year is 2020, right? That's how it works. But I think there's more that you can really get from these reports and from the data that Mobalytics puts out. And then again, as Mobalytics gives us better data, well, I should say, as Riot allows Mobalytics to access better data, because that's currently the roadblock, we can certainly do more with this. And I could break down like the top 5 cards per region if you want to see that. We could talk about, hopefully we've asked for this data, so hopefully we'll get it. We've talked about deck breakdowns in terms of their win rate matchups against other ones. And that's kind of more the more deep data that I want to talk about. And then bring kind of the psychology side to it as well, talking about why people are getting frustrated, why people are calling out for certain bans, and really knowing, again, more the psychology side of things, where those influences might be impacted. So I love doing this. I love talking about data. I love getting kind of more into the nitty gritty of it. But again, this is just what I would say the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more data that we can hopefully get, but this is as about as much as we can really get out of it today. So if you want to see more reports like this, definitely let me know in the comments, or if you'd rather just see kind of that monthly look, so you could see what decks performed really well during week 1 and then fell off, so you could kind of track and have a more discussion about what was good then and what's good now type of thing. I'm all for that as well. I definitely want this to be more open, and I'm looking forward to what people have to say about it, just in terms of other cuts of the data you might be interested in. So with that, that's a quick look, but it wasn't. It's a look at the Mobalytics data for the week of May 4th. And I'm really looking forward to digging into this a bit more next week, where we can see where these trends come out. So if you want to see more videos like this, let me know. Otherwise, it's going to be more the deck building focus and stuff like that. And hopefully this Friday, I actually was just working on a Von Yip deck that we saw in normal matches that I really like. So I'm going to steal that. You know, I'll look back at the video, give them credit, all that stuff. Obviously not my original idea, but I thought it was fun, and we actually had some really awesome times, memorable moments with it, so I think it's a good deck to highlight. Again, not a try-hard, only focused on winning deck, but something that's, fun to play and can have some pretty good moments with. I think it's good to highlight those decks every now and again for Legends and Runeterra. So with that, please, as always, don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more Legends of Runeterra content. That helps out a lot. Also, drop down a like if you want to see more meta reports like this. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed it. Hang in there, everybody. Please stay safe now more than ever, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.